So hopefully from this very brief engagement of using stasis as analysis, you can see that what's at issue in an article helps us to understand the topic broadly, but it can also help us understand the way that the argument is developed. So for a more thorough understanding of that, how stasis analysis can help us understand the way an argument is developed, we're going to take another look at the Herman-Daly speech, which we've looked at before. You've already attempted a summary of this. And we're going to examine that Daly speech in terms of a stasis analysis. So is Daly making arguments of definition, of effect, etc., as a way of helping us to understand the speech. So we're going to take another look at an electronic version of that speech. So here we have the Herman-Daly acceptance speech when he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Council of Science and the Environment. We've looked at this speech already, and you're very familiar with it. Just as with the last time we looked at the speech, we said that his speech doesn't really get going until he asks this question in paragraph 3, what does economic growth mean in a green economy? I've more or less started the analysis there. And I've done this analysis already. I'm just going to kind of walk you through it a little bit. And so what we see in paragraph 3 is that he asks this question, and I've color-coded where I think the different arguments from different stases arise. Arguments in yellow are definitional arguments. Arguments in green are arguments of cause and effect. When we see blue, those are arguments of value. And when we see red, those are arguments of action. And I chose those colors just to be bright on the screen, not for any other kind of metaphorical reason. So not surprisingly, since we know that he used a lot of definitions in this article, or in this argument, in this speech, we see that his very first, his entry into the speech is a definitional argument. And we see that continuing into paragraph 4, where he investigates the term economic growth and its two distinct meanings, and then considers a little bit about how those meanings relate to one another. Into paragraph 5, he continues to have definitional argument. But I have made a comment here at the end, and that's that here when he says this is pure confusion, that we do in fact have a little bit of element of effect here. That we're going to say when he says this is confusion, he's saying that the effect of using this definition is to confuse us. Now, we could also suggest that confusion is something we don't like, that there's a kind of value judgment there, but we'll see that arguments from effect and arguments from value often work together, one being stated, one being implied. So we continue to see that he's using definitional arguments into paragraph 6, where he's explaining what microeconomics is. But then as he starts to ask, well, why do we use kind of different arguments for microeconomy and macroeconomy, even though this is still a question of existence? He's also saying, when he says, why does this simple logic of optimization disappear in microeconomics? Why is the growth of the microeconomy not subject to analogous when-to-stop rule? I'd say we certainly could say that that's an argument of existence. Why does this occur? But he's telling us that it does occur, really. And so what I've noted here is that questions of why slip away from being questions of definition and shift into questions of cause and effect. Why don't we talk about the macroeconomy the same way we talk about the microeconomy is essentially what he is asking us here. So he's thinking about questions of effect. He's still then in the next paragraph continuing to talk to us about arguments of definition, right? What we do and don't recognize about the microeconomy. But again, we can see just from the pattern that he moves from definitional arguments into arguments of effects repeatedly here. So on the macroeconomy, we think the macroeconomy is the whole shebang, but then of course it has this, thinking that has this certain effect. The macroeconomy is this, but the way we think of its growth has a certain effect. So in other words, I've said over here, when it expands, expanding is a question of, or an issue of existence, part of the definition of growth, but understanding the result of that expansion, that becomes a question of effect. So we can see how questions of definition move into being questions of effect. Once we agree with the questions of definition, we can start to question issues of cause and effect. And what I've said too here is that by the end of this paragraph, when Daly says growth of the macroeconomy too imposes a rising opportunity cost that at some point will constrain growth. I've said here that Daly is redefining or reconfiguring the way we think about the macroeconomy. He's arguing in definition again, but using a tactic of definition too. We see that he's going back and forth between effect and definition, because for us to understand the effects as he wants us to understand them, we need to agree with his definition. So that's one of the ways that stasis in the hierarchy of stasis works. Once we agree with his perspective on definitions, he can move us to challenging questions of effect. I think that's very much what we see, not surprisingly, right here in the middle of the argument in paragraph 7. And then I'd say that in paragraph 8, the long, dense paragraph 8, he's continuing to do that, still talking about arguments of effects, right? Logical possibility. Surely if our empirical measure of growth in GDP is GDP based on voluntary buying and selling of final goods and services, then that guarantees that goods grow faster than bads, right? It guarantees that effect. But we see him going back and forth again in this long paragraph between having us understand definitions and moving us to arguments of effect. But then right here, smack in the middle, we see some blue. And he says in the green here, for example, we do not subtract the cost of pollution, but we do add the value of pollution cleanup. And we could say that's an argument of this is what we do. But I think he's also implying some effect here. And I'd say that when he says this is asymmetric accounting, it's an interesting tactic I've seen here. He's using a kind of tactic of definition. He's naming the kind of accounting that we're using. But there's also a real kind of implication there. Asymmetric implies something not favorable, right? So I'd say he's making a value judgment there and telling us that there's something bad going on here. There's an effect and there's a bad effect. And then similarly later in the paragraph, we see him shift from definition to effect to action, really, because he's suggesting something. He's bringing in this other person who's suggesting that we use a different definition and more about value. So when he says here, paradoxically, GDP, whatever else it may measure, is also the best statistical index we have of the aggregate of pollution, depletion, congestion, and loss of biodiversity, we could say that when he says, oh, well, the best, that's a value argument. But instead, I think he's really suggesting that he's talking about the effect of how we use GDP. And then his quote from Bolding, I think we could label an action argument. We should be doing something else in our accounting measures, he's saying there. And then in the end of that paragraph, I think he's offering a value judgment. Not surprisingly, economists and psychologists are now discovering that beyond a sufficiency threshold, the positive correlation between GDP and self-evaluated happiness disappears. The disappearance of happiness, we would certainly all agree that that's a bad thing. So I think he's making a value argument there. And then as he starts to sum up this part of the argument, again, we're seeing effects, right? He's talking about the effects of the way we're using these definitions of economic growth. So he started in definition and moved us to questions of effect. And then in the second half of the argument, again, I think we see him turning to what is a green economy. So we see questions of definition again. And we see the same pattern, that he moves from questions of definition to questions of effect. So toward the end of paragraph 10, he says, we've eagerly done all this use of fossil fuels, etc. And we've done this to grow the economy, but have neglected the fact that at some point, economic growth in sense 1 becomes uneconomic growth in sense 2. So he's bringing us back to a question of effect there. And then going on in the next paragraph, he says, in spite of the fact that green plants have no brains, they have managed to avoid the error of becoming dependent on the less abundant source of available energy. So I've said here, in contrast to what we as humans have done, he's saying here's the effect of what plants have done. And then he jumps, I think, pretty quickly into an action argument. This is what a green economy must do. A green economy must do likewise, seek to maximize use of the abundant flow of solar low entropy and economize on the scarce stock of terrestrial low entropy. And so he's saying this is what must happen. Here's the action that he's arguing for. A little bit more about effects. Specifically, a green economy would invest. This is what it would do. We could also say that that this is an argument of action, but I think it's a little more specific to see that he's building his action argument on positive effects. Here's what a green economy once we know the definition of a green economy, here's what it would do. It would invest. And I think he's slipped in the word squander here, which is a value argument, right? Investing is good, but squandering is bad. So he's got an implication there of negative value. And he continues with his definition. Here's what a green economy would be. Here's what it would look like. And I've said really that in the end here, as we're almost at the end of his argument, I've made this note that this is a little tricky to analyze. And later in the semester, we'll talk about whether or not analysis of stasis has to be really one thing or another, or what happens when we see that we could put an issue in different stases. But for now, we'll try to be a little more fundamental in our understanding. And I've said here that this part is a bit tricky to analyze, perhaps. This is his redefinition, really. And his redefinition, this is what we must think of as growth and a green economy. We could say that his redefinition really has become a kind of action argument. This is what must happen in order for things to be good. We see definition, we see effect, we see value and action all here as he nears the end of his speech. It's really been an argument of definition all along. We've seen predominantly yellow. This is how to define a green economy, he's been saying. But that definition also defines a different result, right? Defines a different effect. That would be true for a lot of definitions, of course. A murder is an intended action that results in a death. But here he's clearly kind of moving toward an effect too. And then even in his penultimate paragraph here, he's going back to talking about understanding a different kind of green economy. Here is what happens when we focus on green in terms of green dollars. So again, he's talking about issues of existence here. I've said here, we see here too that the idea of definition has a result. Here he's noting there's another definition for a green economy, and that definition has an effect. I think the effect is a little bit implied here. And then in his very last argument, I think we see again how he's moved from definition to effect to an argument of action. So he's saying these are the things in the beginning of this penultimate paragraph where he really makes the conclusion of his argument. Recently, this is what we've seen in the debt crisis. This is what has happened. Really, he's saying here, this is what has happened in the recent debt crisis. Then in the second to last sentence of the argument, really, yet we have been so far unable to imagine any policy other than restarting the old growth economy for another round. This is the effect. We have not been able to do anything. And then his final sentence, after the next crisis, we should try to avoid the Ponzi scheme of growth and build a steady state economy, a green economy that is sustainable, just, and sufficient for a good life. This is what we should do, is how he ends his argument. Of course, he has this final paragraph about kind of closing out the speech, but the argument really ends here. Here's what we should do. We should build a steady state economy. And what I've said here is that in this paragraph, again, he's talking about the effects of the current definition of green or of a green economy or growth economy that we use, and we quickly see that it has negative effects. So he's gone through all of his arguments of definition to show us here's the definition, here's what's wrong with the definition. It has negative effects. Negative effects, those are bad. So there's a shift here from definition to effects to an implied argument of value. And then in the final argument, there's this argument of action. We don't want what's bad for us. We want what's good. So we need to get a new definition of a green economy. And then I've asked here a kind of closing question. Would we say then that this has really been an action argument? What has Daly's aim been? And I think that's a good question for us to end on. Thinking back to Harris's ideas of aim and project and methods, we could say that his methods have clearly been largely to take us through questioning and redefining what we mean by these terms, growth economy, green economy, and that his aim has been to give us a new definition. But of course, we don't just need a new definition for the sake of having a new definition. We need a new definition to do something with it. So while we might say that his final point is, of course, to propose a different way of seeing things and therefore a different way of doing things. So what I've tried to do here in this in this presentation is have you think about the way that stasis theory can both help you invent arguments. If you think of the questions from stasis, you can come up with arguments, as we came up with arguments about gossip, how we might approach gossip as an academic topic, but then also the way that stasis can help us understand or analyze what is at issue in an argument. So thank you very much for listening.